Video games are art. I fully believe that. With that said, it's still not a very highly respected art form. It's better than it used to be. There was once a time when every single tragedy was blamed on video games instead of any actual cause, mostly because it was an easy scapegoat for politicians to blame, so they didn't have to do anything substantial to fix the issues. But these days, gaming is so profitable that outside of a few outliers, it's not in politicians' best interests to blame video games anymore, because more than likely, they have a few companies in their back pocket. But even still, even though gaming is taken more seriously than it used to be, it's still not taken as seriously as other forms of media, especially cinema. Even to this day, the general consensus is that the highest esteem a video game franchise can achieve is to get a movie adaptation. Whereas, think about it the other way around. Think of a movie getting a video game adaptation. At best, people don't care. At worst, it's seen as an insult. And that says to me that gaming isn't taken as seriously, despite the fact that I believe it's the greatest form of media and entertainment. Yes, there's more of a learning curve, and yes, some people are never going to be able to learn that curve, so there is that inherent aspect that the industry has to overcome. There are apparently 3.3 billion active gamers in the world, but a vast majority of that is likely casual. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Casual gamers are the people who keep the industry afloat. But even still, with the industry being as profitable, as large, and as popular as it is, you'd think that after 50 some odd years, since the days of the Magnavox Odyssey, the industry would start to gain a level of respect. I mean, think about this. Think about all the classic films that were made in the first 50 years that cinema existed. It's hard to know exactly where to start because film was such a scattershot and decentralized thing to where you can't pinpoint an exact moment it started, like with the Magnavox Odyssey, or possibly Pong were the beginnings of gaming. So let's just say that large-scale cinema started in 1900. Well, between 1900 and 1950, look at all the classic films that are still talked about to this day. Wizard of Oz, Snow White, Gone with the Wind, Citizen Kane, the original All Quiet on the Western Front. It's safe to say that there were a lot of respected classics from the era, so that by 50 years into the industry, it was considered a very serious thing, and yet we still don't have that level of respect in the gaming industry, so why is that? Well, this is a question that has plagued the game-playing public the world over for Lord knows how long. While there are plenty of potential explanation, the skill curve means that there's probably still a level of ignorance about what gaming is, or what it could be depending on how old you are, and how long it's been since you've played something. Therefore, some people's idea of what a game might be could be as archaic as Pac-Man. And if that's your idea of what a game is, of course, you're not going to give the medium any respect. But that's only an explanation for the people who are ignorant of the industry. Meanwhile, even on subreddits and the like, you still get fans of various franchises saying that they would love to see X game or Y game be turned into a movie. And why is that? Well, I'll throw my hat into the ring in this instance. Here's what I think. I think cinema was taken relatively seriously from a very early point because it was an evolution of stage play, essentially taking the exact same idea but evolving it into a scenario where you sit in a theater watching a pre-recorded play instead of a live-action play. Now, obviously, stage play wasn't always considered a very high art form. Back in the Shakespearean days, for example, stage plays were considered very lowbrow because Shakespeare was trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator to make the most money possible. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Something that's often forgotten about in English classes these days because all his work has been grandfathered into being the quintessential high art. But I digress. It was around the early to mid-1800s that stage plays started to be taken more seriously and eventually were considered the highest form of art available at the time. Something that rich folk went to in their free time to entertain themselves. And that's what gave cinema an instantly bulletproof reputation. It's the thing that made it so cinema was instantly seen as high art and something that was to be respected above most other forms of media. The fact that it was so instantly accessible also helped its appeal and its widespread nature, given the fact that you could just sit back and watch a thing. Literature is arguably seen as a higher art form to some, and it's the oldest form of art, having existed pretty much since the dawn of time, but not everyone can read. But cinema had the reputation and it had the accessibility. Now, video games on the other hand, what did video games evolve out of? It definitely wasn't something as respected as stage plays. Video games evolved out of children's toys. I mean, that's not entirely the story because very early on, things like arcade cabinets were marketed to adults. They were put in bars and were intended as something you would do between drinks. But as far as home entertainment, which after a certain point dominated gaming, that was always considered an evolved form of a children's toy that you would plug into your TV. It was so closely attributed to the concept of a children's toy that for the first 20 or 30 years that video games existed, it was common for people to be judgmental over the fact that you're older than 12 but still played video games, because it was viewed in the same way as a 25-year-old playing with Thomas the Tank Engine toys. It also didn't help that early games were so simple that it would be hard not to attribute them with children's toys. A children's toy only usually had a few functions, but when you look at games from the Atari, the NES, or even the SNES to a lesser degree, they are in theory very simple activities. Plus, the fact that games like Mortal Kombat sort of built into the juvenile reputation that gaming had certainly didn't help. It wasn't until at least the late 90s, but more likely the early 2000s, where the capabilities of video games had evolved to the point of being able to have more in-depth mechanics and story elements. That's when the entire medium started to be taken more seriously as a general medium and not a children's toy, as more people endeavored to show the limits of what video games were capable of as a medium, and as the entire industry moved in a more mature direction. Also, this is when the first generation of people who never gave the medium up got old enough that they could have kids of their own, and suddenly it was something that was more entrenched in the culture. A significant chunk of people now consider video games to be something mundane, something not even worth bothering about because it's so ingrained in our society at this point. Even my retirement age father plays casual games. But we still have tacit disrespect to the entire industry every time they want a movie or a TV adaptation of a beloved video game property. I've seen this countless times, where the desire for a non-video game adaptation is just as strong, if not stronger, than the desire to have a sequel or two. And I think that tacit disrespect always comes back to that same thing. It always comes back to that stigma. Even if video games are more accepted as a worthwhile medium these days, it still has that stench of being associated with children's toys on it, even if that hasn't necessarily been the case for decades. So that the entire culture of video games is seen as a lesser than medium of entertainment. It's a cultural bias that inflicts itself actively to some but passively to most everyone else, a generational bias that's passed completely unintentionally. To the point where I believe that when people say they want a TV or film adaptation of one of their favorite games, I don't think they're saying that necessarily because they think it'll be good or because it'll elevate the concept, but out of a sense of validation. It validates you to know the thing that you like is considered important enough to get a movie adaptation, to get what is ostensibly the highest honor due to being the highest form of art. Ostensibly. And even the people making the games passively view games as a lesser form of art. How many times have you heard a game described as cinematic? What that says to me is that the entire industry has an inferiority complex to where it's trying to emulate a completely different medium, because apparently the medium itself simply isn't good enough. But I guess the question is, will video games ever shake the stigma? Will it ever be equal to cinema or surpass it? I don't know. It's easy to say that once all the cultural sticklers that created the bias in the first place die, that the bias will cease to exist. But I don't think that's necessarily the case, because the bias is entrenched in the culture, and when something is that deeply ingrained, it's not easily broken. The issue is that in some places these beliefs are so entrenched that you can't simply get rid of them because the beliefs of the parent will be passed down to the child. And then the cycle begins anew, and the thing about biases is that you don't necessarily need to rely on a bias to exist from birth to become entrenched. All it takes is the right person making the right argument, and somebody might change their mind if they're in some way predisposed to believing that. So if video games will ever shake the stigma, I don't know. It's hard to say, but if it does, it'll probably take a long time and a very large cultural shift for that ever to happen. I feel like video games are in a very similar position to Western animation because a live-action adaptation of something animated is considered to many an inherent elevation of the concept, even if there's nothing wrong with the story as presented. And why is that? Well, because outside of Japan, animation is considered inherently kiddie because going back to the early days of animation, it was something aimed at kids and not adults. So even now, even with tons of examples of animated movies and TV shows aimed at adults or things that are for a more general audience and have a deep artistic merit, You still get a negative stigma attached to it, even if it has absolutely no reason to have the stigma. I remember back in university when I wanted to go see Into the Spider-Verse with some friends, one person who quite frankly wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed said he wasn't gonna see it because it's animated. Didn't give us a reason other than that, just that it was animated and therefore it wasn't worth seeing. And because animation is much older than video games and still hasn't been able to shake that reputation of being a lesser form of art, that says to me that video games still have a long way to go before they can ever be considered the elevated form of art that I believe they are. But I believe that change begins with you. Be aware of your biases, because if you ever catch yourself thinking that you want a movie adaptation of something, stop and ask yourself, is that actually something that would make the story better? If the story is just fine the way it is, then it's fine the way it is. Which is not to say that movie adaptations are inherently a bad thing, but they're also not inherently a good thing. Be aware that you probably don't even want a movie adaptation, you just want the validation. You should find validation through building something up rather than tacitly tearing it down by assuming it's only going to get the recognition it deserves by adhering to outdated beliefs. Besides, let's be honest, you don't need validation. If you like something, that should be enough. If one person subverts their own biases, that's one less person to disrespect the medium that deserves a lot more respect than it has. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Dick Kickham, Gaw004, Hydra Overlord, My Name is Tank, FarmCat84, Rav, Ranger X, Sphinx, Weird Webster, and Will Stokes for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.